Charles Manson may have been one of the most evil people who ever lived, the mass murderer responsible for the Tate LaBianca killings back in 1969. Infamous. Did you know that he was actually trying to start a race war? He was. According to the prosecutor, that was his motivation. He wanted people of color to be blamed for these horrible killings, and in his fried mind, this made sense that somehow a race war would erupt in the aftermath. Sadly and fascinatingly, the media right now seem to be committed to starting a race war in this country. Now, you heard about what happened in Atlanta to all those people and the massage parlors. A terrible story. And the media, well, they want to tell a certain version of this story, their version, and they're very, very anxious to do so.
There are a lot of intense discussions here about potential hate crimes.
Police not ruling out a hate crime amid a rise in anti-Asian attacks.
It should be called a hate crime.
Authorities have not ruled out whether the crimes were racially motivated.
There are plenty of people who believe that this was a hate crime.
The idea that this was a hate crime.
Officials are not calling this a hate crime, but not ruling it out.
They are chomping at the bit to call this a hate crime, to say that the victims were singled out because of their race. There are a couple of problems here, though. Law enforcement, they're not saying that.
This is still early, but he does claim that it was not racially motivated.
Not racially motivated. He goes on.
He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction, and sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places, and it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. Like I said, it's still early on, but those were comments that he made.
Comments that he made. Now, that's Jay Baker. He's a sheriff's deputy acting as a public information officer, telling the public about the case. I don't see a problem. I don't think those are his thoughts. He's relaying to us what the accused killer has said. But that's not good at all for the left-leaning media. Nope, they don't like it.
The suspect, Robert Long, told police he's a sex addict, not a racist. But there are plenty of people who believe that this was a hate crime. Activist and author Helen Zia said authorities are missing important context.
Hypersexualization of Asian American women is part of the racism toward Asian Americans. And to say that sexual addiction is an excuse or a reason to go on a mass killing rampage is ridiculous. He's going to take the word of a mass shooter who happens to be white against the lived experience of the Asian American community.
All right, look, she's written textbooks and she's off wherever she is, but she knows about this case. The law enforcement officer, Jay Baker, who, by the way, has just been removed. They're not going to let him talk to the press anymore. He was talking about what he knew from the suspect, what the suspect told them. Quite frankly, I appreciated this candor. But somehow, I think I know the reason, they're trying to pin a lot of this on him. Check this out.
When I was watching that news conference and he called it a bad day, and all I could think of was 8 people are grieving tonight. It's a guy that had an issue. He blames a race of people for his problem. And then he goes and eliminates what he thinks to eliminate the temptation that he has an issue with. It's outrageous.
It's a peculiar amount of empathy for a mass shooter.
It's humanizing the shooter. Yeah. It's humanizing the shooter once again.
Yeah.
And can I point out that the shooter is a white man who is alive after they knew that he'd killed 8 people.
And he was armed.
And he was armed, and they knew that too.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I've heard about 4 times now that the suspect is white. Did you get that? I got it. All right. We heard it from the guest. We hear it from Gail. Humanizing the shooter? Looks to me like he's probably guilty, but he is a human being, right? And I think he should be punished if he's guilty, and he probably is, but sorry, he's a human being. Very odd conversation. Quite frankly, I think he gets worse.
Sex and racism seems very intertwined here. And I don't think that we should miss that point.
The police official who indicated that this guy had a bad day and that he was targeting these places of business because of his sex addiction, that's racist, that's misogyny. When you use that language around Asian women to talk about Asian women, that is misogynist.
Sex and racism are intertwined here, and he can say, I'm not a sex addict, or I'm a sex addict, not a racist, but it's a distinction that may not have a difference.
Now, what the hell is he talking about? This is the wokest wannabe conversation I've ever heard. And did he call the police spokesman a misogynist and a racist for just relaying to us what the suspect said? I think so. And you know who they cite as the source of wisdom here? That unfunny comedian Trevor Noah.
Please, don't tell me that this thing had nothing to do with race. Even if the shooter says that, he thinks it had to do with his sex addiction. You can't disconnect this violence from the racial stereotypes that people attach to Asian women. This guy blamed a specific race of people for his problems and then murdered them because of it. If that's not racism, then the word has no meaning.
Couple of things. What racial stereotypes does Trevor Noah have about Asian women? Also, let's see here. If that's not racism, nothing's racism. That's the problem when you call everything racism. The word starts to lose its impact. Here's the facts. A lot of the victims here were not Asian. Let's put them up on the screen, please. We have an Hispanic woman, we have an unidentified white male, and we have a Hispanic man who was injured in the shooting, but he is still alive. You didn't hear that. You could watch hours of coverage on cable news, and you can watch the broadcast news, and you won't hear anything about that. Isn't that interesting? Because that complicates the narrative. Why point that out when you can have so much fun making your point, highlighting all kinds of grievances you've had with America going back maybe centuries?
Many of the attacks against Asian American women, including this one, can be traced back to those long perpetuated stereotypes.
Right. In this country, there's been kind of this prevailing stereotype that Asian women are sexually deviant. We are submissive. We're docile. I talked to historian Ellen Wu yesterday, and she mentioned that a lot of these associations were further confirmed when the U.S. got into wars in the Asia-Pacific region, in the Philippines, in Japan, in Korea, in Vietnam. Wu stresses that a lot of the ideas around sex work that people have around Asian women in those countries, they come from this, this yearning for survival because of U.S. imperial expansion.
Okay, I've been taking notes, and I think I got it. General MacArthur and the U.S. military is responsible for what happened in Atlanta. The U.S. military going back to World War II in Korea. How about that? And they can feel so good about themselves when they do these stories. They can feel so good about themselves. Watch this. Talk about virtue signaling.
Kimmy, it's excellent reporting, and I commend folks to NBCNews.com to read your piece. Thank you very much for joining us and to talk it through here on the show. I really appreciate it. Coming up after the break, the new COVID passport.
And on to other news. Look, if they really want to know about racism against Asians, all that MSNBC anchor has to do is walk down the hall and knock on Al Sharpton's door. You know, Al Sharpton works at MSNBC. He has a show. He also has a horrible history of racism against all kinds of groups, including Asian Americans. Here he is in 1990 leading a boycott of 2 Korean grocery stores in Brooklyn, New York. A huge story at the time, and Al organized it to the hilt. Thousands of people tormented Asian merchants because of a petty dispute between a business owner and a black customer. It went on for over a year. That's Al Sharpton. Al Sharpton. If MSNBC wants a better understanding of racism against Asians, they don't have to look back centuries. They don't have to blame Donald Trump or the movies. They will. I'll get to that in a moment. They can look to Black Lives Matter and the far left in America.
This establishment is not black owned, but you're stealing black culture. Is this not black culture? Trap tea, the boba plug? No, you're thieves. Asian people stealing black culture once again. It's okay, you'll be exposed though. You're not black owned. You're stealing black culture. You're stealing black culture. No, I came here because I thought it was black owned. That's why I came here. I told my friends I'm supporting a black business.
Asians are routinely victimized for their success. Their merit is held against them. Hear what's happening at some of the best universities in the country? They'll only let so many Asians in because they don't want that many around. They're qualified to take a lot more spots than they're allowed to occupy. Big problems across the Ivy League and in our nation's leading universities. It's real. That's a real thing. And the Asian community has been taking the brunt of it. It's sad and it needs to be fixed. But again, there are political points to be made here. They're not going to talk about this because it takes us too far away from the real target. You know who that is. You know.
There's no question that some of the damaging rhetoric that we saw during the prior administration, blaming, calling COVID, the Wuhan virus or other things, led to, perceptions of the Asian American community that are inaccurate, unfair, have raised, threatening, has elevated threats against Asian Americans.
You see the tie-in right back to Donald Trump. They're still obsessed with him, and they don't want him running for president in 2024, whatever they can do to stop him. So President Harris, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden called her Mr. President today, and Joe Biden will be heading to Atlanta this weekend for some political pandering and exploitation. All right, I want to finish this with a little bit of Trump truth.
You are fake news.
They'd love to say he's a racist and a xenophobe. Not true. Donald Trump, even before politically correct anybody had ever even heard of the term, was open-minded and the opposite of racist. I'm telling you, look at this from 1987, how excited he is about selling Trump Tower apartments to foreigners. Foreigners were another big market: Europeans, South Americans, Arabs, and Asians. Practically speaking, we offered them an immediate advantage. You see, here's the thing. In New York, a lot of buildings were closed to them. He goes on. The worst part is that many people on these co-op boards, old stuffy buildings in New York, get their kicks from showing off their power. It's absurd and probably illegal, but it happened to be great for Trump Tower. Many wealthy foreigners didn't have the proper social references for these cooperatives, or didn't want to put themselves through the scrutiny of a bunch of prying strangers. Instead, they came to us. I like that little nugget. I like it a lot. He's the opposite of what the fake news tells you.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.